Scripture reading this morning is going to come from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 6. Again, that is Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. Then she arose, and with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread.
And in studying in preparation for this sermon series, I was not really confused or concerned about how I would approach it because, the book is very clear on what it's about. It's about the redemption through the kinsman redeemer. And if you look throughout the book of Ruth, what a lot of people will pull out of this book is either the relationship between Ruth and Naomi, two widows and taking care of each other, or you will see the relationship between Ruth and Boaz and see a very beautiful love story as you read about the kinsman redeemer. But in preparation for this book, as I'm reading about these two different approaches, I noticed that there was a key character missing in all of these approaches, is that God was not really mentioned in either approach. And yes, we will observe and make application of those two relationships, that is, a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law, and husband and wife with Ruth and Boaz, but what I also want to make sure that we study is God throughout the book of Ruth, which sometimes gets overlooked. And in getting into the book of Ruth, before we really get into the book, we really need to look at some background. Because right off the bat, if you look in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land." So the very first sentence in the book of Ruth gives us a timeline of which all of these things are happening. It's happening during the time of the judges, which if you look at the book previous, the first 20, all of the 21 chapters in the book, you will see that there is a key theme that every man did that which was right in his own eyes because there was no king in Israel. There was really no leadership. The Jewish people had completely rejected God's leadership and then therefore just wanted to do whatever they wanted to do. And they would only go to God when things got difficult. And in the book of Ruth, what I find fascinating is, with this in mind, a group of people, talking about the Jewish people, they would only go to God during a time when it was difficult. They are currently going through a difficult time at the beginning of the book of Ruth. It says, "And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab, and his wife with his two sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah." Now, why on earth would this man and his wife with his two sons travel to a Gentile land? Well, it's because there came about in the days of the judges a famine. So they're going through a difficult time, and during a difficult time in the book of Judges, where do people normally go when they need help? Usually they'll run to God because they have no other choice. Here, they don't even run to God, they run to the Gentiles. Now, what I want to focus on in this entire chapter this morning, Lord willing, is we're going to look at the finding provision in the midst of pain. Finding provision in the midst of pain. Ruth chapter 1. Now, again, we're going to look at the relationship between Naomi and Ruth. And as we go throughout this book, look at the relationship between Boaz and Ruth. But we have to understand why we have this account to begin with. Why do we have an example of a daughter-in-law taking care of her mother-in-law and a mother-in-law trying to help her daughter-in-law find a husband to provide? Well, really, if everything is boiled down to its main components, you'll see it's because God has a plan. He's working through these individuals to carry out his ultimate plan, which is to bring about Jesus the Christ. Now, in this chapter, we notice two main points, okay? 2 points. Verses 1 to 13, the very first thing we see in verses 1 to 13 is consequences of leaving God. Consequences of leaving God. You look for provision and you find bitterness. Now, at the latter half of this chapter, what we notice is the complete opposite. In verses 14 to 18, we notice consequences of returning to God. You proclaim bitterness and are given provision. It's a very interesting chapter, and honestly, in reading this chapter last week, I was wondering, do I need to preach chapter 2 as well? Because I wouldn't be able to do it verse by verse just because time wouldn't allow. But if you just read chapter 1, it's a very depressing chapter, even the way that it ends. And I don't want to leave everybody on a cliffhanger in bitterness as Naomi does at the end of this chapter. But it's not about bitterness. It's about finding this pleasantness in God, which is actually what Naomi means, one who is pleasant. Now, let's look at our very first point together, verses 1 to 13. Consequences of leaving God. You look for provision and you find bitterness. Now, in verses 1 to 5, what we notice is the making of widows. The making of widows. One of the saddest passages in all of Scripture, verses 1 through 5. We already read the first 2 verses, but let's go ahead and read the latter part of verse 2. It says, "Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband." This is a very, very sad story starting out. In fact, you don't really see anything lighting up, if I can use that term. It doesn't get any better, really, until you get into chapter 2. And it seems like it's just, where's the hope in this? It starts out sad. The middle is sad. There's a good character here by the name of Ruth who, even though I'm suffering, I'm going to take care of my mother-in-law because she's also suffering. It seems like that's the only good thing that's happening in this chapter. Now, before I go into these different characters and find the application, where did they go? If you're studying the Bible, you need to be asking questions. Who, what, when, where, why, how. You need to be asking these questions. Here in this context, we need to be asking the where. Where did they go in a time of pain and suffering? They did not go to God. That's number 1. Where did they go instead? They went into the land of Moab, a Gentile land. Now, in order to truly understand what's going on here, we have to understand what Moab is, the land of Moab and the people who live there. And this goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 19 and verse 37. Now, put yourself in the time of Ruth, okay? We really wouldn't understand this fact unless we understood the Moabites. But for them to go to the land of Moab actually was something looked down upon by the Jewish people. In fact, when they come back, Naomi is encouraging them, you stay in your own land. There's no reason to come back with me. I can't provide any more sons for you, and there's nothing good for you in the land of Judah. Just stay in your own land. Why would Naomi say something like that? Well, in Genesis chapter 19 and verse 37, you see a very, very awful situation happening. From Moab, the son of Lot, through one of his daughters in a relationship of incest, came a great nation. Not a great nation in the sense of great morals, but a great nation. Moab, along with his brother Ben-Ami, Lot had two sons while being taken advantage of by his daughters. And this really ties into the Sodomite type culture. If you look at the culture of Sodom, we really only get a glimpse of a little bit of how wicked they are in the book of Genesis. And what we see is awful. And as you go through the minor prophets and the major prophets, you'll see a little bit more insight of the Moabites and the Ammonites and just how awful they were. If you do some research and look at the archaeological discoveries of manuscripts and the tablets that they have found that relate back to this Sodomite type culture, when Sodom very first began, one of the cultural coming into the city that they would do for anybody, if you wanted to be a part of the civilization of Sodom, you had to go through a trial. And this trial was for those who were strangers as well as those who were born into the city. And what they would do is, at a certain age and up, the elders or the men of the city, the leaders, would take the young men, the young boys, into the wilderness and teach them how to hunt, how to start fires, how to survive off the land, so that they could then be strong leaders in the city. But what they would do is they would take advantage of these young men and young boys within these trial periods. So it went from just one-on-one perversion relationships to, if you look in now the book of Genesis, when these men come up to Lot and say, hey, what are they? These are strangers. They need to come out so that we may know them. You can see this cultural perversion of, it's turned from, you know what, we need to initiate them into the city of, now we're going to use this as an example or a way to fulfill our own desires. Sodom was known for exploiting young children, specifically young boys. And you can see this same lifestyle carried through the Moabites and the Ammonites, and you can actually see it in the daughters of Lot. They exploited their own father and then came about two sons. Well, these sons would grow up, bring about the Moabite nation and the Ammonite nation, and these would bring about two gods. You've got Shamash and Molech. Now, Molech sounds pretty familiar, does it not? Both of these gods were worshipped by offering up their children in burnt offerings while they were still alive. And you actually see this in the book of Amos. Amos chapter 1 and verse 13. This was, thus says the Lord, for 3 offenses of the sons of Ammon and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because they ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead in order to enlarge their borders. Now, if you read this at face value, it seems like an oxymoron. You don't expand your borders or grow your nation by killing your own people. That doesn't make any sense. Well, what they were doing was, in order to expand their land, they would have to conquer other nations. And what Ammon would do, as well as the Moabites, they would offer up children to their gods and say, please allow us to have this victory so that we can expand our borders. Well, it seemed like they couldn't wait long enough to murder these children, so they would just rip open the pregnant women and offer those infants and say, we need to enlarge our borders now. We can't wait for them to give birth. We need to do it now. This just shows how corrupt Ammon and Moab was. And something for Moab, Amos chapter 2 and verse 1, for 3 offenses of Moab and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment, because he burned the bones of the kings of Edom to lime. They not only murdered infants, but they desecrated graves. really for fun. And then a little bit more insight, just to, I guess you could say, put a little cherry on top of the wickedness of Moab. You've got Numbers 25, 1 through 2. They tried to lead God's people astray by sending in women, acting as prostitutes to lure them into idol worship. You've got Judges chapter 3, verses 15 to 33. They were one of the very first nations to capture and enslave the Jewish people under the time of the Judges. Now, wait a minute. What is the time frame of the book of Ruth? During the time of the Judges. So you've got you've got a Jewish couple and their sons going to a nation that once enslaved them for help. This is backwards logic. Elimelech, what are you doing? And there's a lot more that we could say about Moab, but due to time, we just can't talk about all of it. But I feel like we have painted a pretty good picture of just how wicked Moab is and was at that time. Now, with this being said, you have a couple leaving God's people from the land of Bethlehem, the house of bread, in the land of Judah, in the country of Judah, which is the royal tribe of which the Christ would come about. They leave God's provision to go to a Gentile land, in the land of Moab, which, by the way, Moab means of my father. So they're leaving a land of bread to go to a land that is literally named after an incestual relationship. Now, we haven't even really gotten past verses 1 through 3. And now we can kind of see where the mindset is of the Jewish people. They have completely forgotten God. Absolutely. God is nowhere in the picture. Well, there's a famine in the land. We got to find food to provide for ourselves. In verse 1, leaving God's care, notice what happens. You see a parallel between Elimelech and Abraham. Does anybody remember the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis when there was a famine in the land? What did Abraham do? Abraham left God's provision, didn't trust in God, and went to Egypt, and guess what he found? He found trouble. What happened to Elimelech and his people when they left God's provision and care and forgot to trust in God and went to a Gentile nation? They found trouble. And notice this, usually in Scripture, when you see a reference of famine, that's usually a preface to God's fixing to do something great. We see this in Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 19, as well as Leviticus 26, 18 through 20. Every single time there is a famine in the land, God is fixing to do something great. And what I find fascinating is that what's prefaced is the famine, and what precedes the famine? The redemption of not just Jewish people, but Gentile people through Boaz and Ruth in order to bring about the Christ. God is fixing to do something great, and yet Elimelech and Naomi and all of their children have no idea. Now, very quickly, we haven't made any application here. If you were to make an application, perhaps you are going through a very difficult time in your life. Maybe there is a famine in your land. What are you going to do? Are you going to plant down and trust in God that He will provide? Or are you going to go to the world to seek help? Because I can tell you this, if you go to the world to seek help, all you're going to find is death. And that's exactly what Elimelech found. In verses 2 to 5, we see lamenting, grieving, and crying. The characters in this account, you've got Elimelech, which, by the way, when you study the Bible, something that I would really encourage you to do is look at the names, the meaning of the names of the individuals, because especially in the prophets, they mean something. That their names actually have something to do with the message that they're about to give to the people. Do you know what Elimelech's name means? My God is king. He wasn't treating God as his king. He was treating really himself or Moab as his king. I'm in desperate need of provision. I'm not going to go to God. I'm going to go to Moab. I'm going to go to the land so that I can provide for myself. You see what happens when we try to provide for ourselves? All we do is find death and bitterness. Now let's keep reading. verses 6 to 13, the mourning of widows. So you got the making of widows, verses 1 through 5. Look at verses 6 through 13. Now, when we get to verse 6, all the men have died up to this point. Now look at what's happening. Then she arose, verse 6, with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "No, return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." Now, in reading this chapter, I really struggled with the fact that Naomi says that the Lord has dealt against her. And then, because the Lord has dealt against her, she gives herself a new name, Mara, which we're going to get to later. But do you notice that after she gives her own name, Mara, how is she referred to the rest of the book? She's still referred to as Naomi. God never gives her the name Mara. She gives herself that name. She gives herself bitterness, not God. And nowhere does it say that God did this to Elimelech and his sons. She's coming to a conclusion on her own that God has done something to her. Why would she come to that conclusion? I'm not saying God did or didn't. I'm simply saying that there is no evidence that God has done this. And also, why would Naomi come to this conclusion? Well, remember what happened in verses 1 through 5? What did Naomi and Elimelech do? They left God. God did not leave them. They left God and his people. In verses 6 through 7, in the mourning of widows, we see caring for the widow. She left the borders. Now, it says, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. The accompanying their mother-in-law to the borders of their own land would probably be an act of oriental courtesy, as one commentary says. Naomi was planning on going back. She did not want her daughters-in-law to go with her. Not because she didn't love them. In fact, she refers to them as daughters. There's a bond, there's a very close bond here. It's that she loved them enough that she didn't want them to come back home with her. Why on earth would she do that? Why would she say, go back home? Well, one is because she had nothing to give them. There is nothing that Naomi could have given these women in order to validate them remaining with her. And she did not want to rob them of the possibility and opportunity of getting remarried, having a strong household that would provide for them. She didn't want to rob them of that. But notice the love from her daughters-in-law. They said, no, we want to be with you. That actually says a lot about Naomi. Because I'm very blessed to have good in-laws. If you ever talk to me about my mother-in-law, I might give her a hard time in front of her, because we love each other. But when it boils down to it, I truly love my in-laws because they are good, God-fearing people, and they are some of the most humble people you will ever meet. In order for somebody to truly love their in-laws, they have to be good people. And I understand you love them because they're family, but you know what? I know of some people that they can't stand to be around their in-laws. because they're always fighting, they're always bickering. You're not worthy of my son. You're not worthy of my daughter. She calls them daughters. She loved these two ladies as her own children. She loved them so much and really displayed that love to an effect where these two women said, we want to be with you. We want to be with you rather than our own people. Now, what does this say about Naomi? This says that even though, I know I kind of gave Elimelech and Naomi a hard time at verses 1 through 5, but honestly, they were good people because they set an example to Ruth and Orpah enough to where they said, we want to know more about these people. We want to know more about this God that you serve. And we actually will see that here at the end of this lesson more in Ruth. Look at verses 8 through 9. Compassion from the widow. She gave blessings. She says, go, return each of you to your mother's house, encourages them to go back where there is provision and care. She knew that if they went back with her, she couldn't provide for them. And so she said, I love you enough to give you a chance to go back to your own land and find provision because I can't give it to you. You know, that's a very interesting mindset because that's not what their mindset was in verses 1 through 5. They thought that they could provide for themselves, and now they're finding out we can't even provide for ourselves, much less for these two women. How often do we think that we can provide for ourselves, and then it gets to a point where there are people coming to us for help, and we're thinking, I have nothing to give you. I can't provide for you. I can't even provide for myself. I'm struggling myself. You know, I asked that question, put that in a spiritual context. Sometimes we spiritually try to provide for ourselves, and guess what happens? We find death and bitterness. And then sometimes people may come to us and ask for help, and we say, I don't have anything to give you. I wish that I could, but I don't have that kind of power. I don't have that kind of provision. She also says, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. She wishes the same kindness as they have shown to her. She also says, may the Lord grant you that you may find a place of rest, each one in the house of her husband. Encourages them to find rest in future husbands blessed by God. Again, we see the love of Naomi. You know, I can't imagine what it's like being a widow or widower, but I can't imagine having an opportunity of having people stay with you that love you, that want to take care of you, and you have a decision to make. Do I want to have them stay with me to keep me from being lonely and keep me from mourning by myself, or and doing that, robbing them of an opportunity of a good life? Or am I going to send them away so that they can find joy and happiness in their own marriages? This says a lot about Naomi's courage, not just her spiritual outlook on things, but also her courage. She was willing to go through this by herself so that the young daughters of hers could then have a future ahead of them. She didn't want to rob them of that. And also it says, then she kissed them and they raised their voices and wept. It shows love and compassion upon them, though through mourning and weeping. The kiss, this idea of kissing, parting as well as meeting, was a customary, friendly, and respectful salutations in the East. But you know what? I don't just see this as a custom. This was a relationship between two daughters and a mother that really had made up their mind, we're never going to see each other again. And then you've got verses 10 to 13, the countenance of the widow. She showed bitterness. She came to the conclusion that there was no hope for the two women where she was going. There was bitterness upon her by God. God had done this to her, and she could not provide for them any more sons to marry. Therefore, there was nothing for them. Now, again, in reading this, something that I truly struggled with was this attitude. Now, some people say, well, Anthony, that seems kind of harsh because you didn't lose your spouse. I'm sure you'd be in the same situation. Probably. But, nowhere in Scripture does it say that God did this to Naomi. Now, this is where we're going to make a really big application, because this application is going to be the foundation for the rest of the book. When something bad happens to you or to me, our conclusion it shouldn't be the first, nor should it be the last. It should never even be an option that God has done this to me. Because what happens at the very beginning of this book? They left God. Now, I'm not saying that they died because they left God, but here's the spiritual application. What happens when you leave God? You are spiritually murdering yourself. That's what you're doing. Now, what is this whole book about? The whole book is about the kinsman redeemer, redeeming the family line of Elimelech. Now, in the spiritual application of all of this, what does all of this mean? Well, why does God give us this book? Well, if you look at the book as a whole, the kinsman redeemer, Boaz is actually a type of Jesus the Christ. And if you look at who he's redeeming, he's not just redeeming Elimelech's line with Naomi, he's redeeming the Gentile line as well with Ruth, which is fascinating because what Boaz has just done is redeemed Jew and Gentile. Now, what is it that Jesus does? Jesus redeems us, Jew or Gentile, and God is doing this to bring about the Christ through Boaz and Ruth. Now, continue reading with me, 14 through 18. Consequences of returning to God. You proclaim bitterness and are given provision. Now, before we start verse 14, there's something that we need to notice in verse 6, our scripture reading. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard of the land of Moab, that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. Now, with that statement in our minds, let's read verses 14 and following. It says in verses 14 to 21, Ruth talks about being grafted into a family. She wants to leave the Moabites and then be grafted into the family of Naomi, the Jewish people. Now notice what it says in verses 14 through 21. It says, and they lifted their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Now, look at verse 14. In verse 14, we see Ruth's loyalty. This word clung to her, literally to stick or hold onto. It's used actually to describe a disease clinging onto a body that's infested. You can't let go of the disease. It's too far gone. That's how dedicated Ruth was of being with Naomi. She says, I'm not going anywhere. You can tell me to leave. You can try to leave me. I'm going to cling to you, and you're never going to see me let go. Now, why on earth would Ruth do such a thing? Leave her land, everything she knows, her home life, all of her friends, to go with a woman who into a strange land that she knows nothing about. What would convince such a person to do such a thing? Well, it's because of God. And this is where a lot of us will probably overlook this fact because we focus a lot on, and rightfully so, on the relationship and application of the relationship between Ruth and Naomi. Everything in this book is about God and carrying out his plan. How on earth could somebody from such a wicked city like Moab be convinced to leave everything they know to go into a land they have nothing, they know nothing about except for the fact that there is a God that provides? Well, it's just that. She was able to see God in Naomi. She was able to see this kind and tenderhearted and providing God through this woman. And she says, I want to be with you. Your God shall be my God. And notice what Orpah did. She went back to her gods. Ruth said, no, I'm going to go with your God because your God is the one that's providing for his people. I love you. Wherever you go, I will go. Your God shall be my God. Your people shall be my people. I want to be part of God's people. Now look at verses 19 to 22. Grieving over a family. It says, so they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Now, we're going to conclude with this. 19 to 21, we see Naomi's bitterness. And then verse 22, we see Naomi's return. Now, something that needs to be pointed out, and probably the key to all of this chapter, is verse 6 and verse 22. Because in verse 6, you have that God is providing for his people. And in verse 22, you see that they came back at the beginning of barley harvest, at the height of provision. Now, what I find fascinating in all of this, in the I don't like to say story, in the account of Elimelech and his sons, in the account of Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, in the account of Boaz that we'll see later in the coming months, something that screams out in this chapter is, even when we leave God, God is going to provide for his people. Even in a time of pain and suffering, God is going to provide for his people. In a time of loss, God is going to provide for his people. In a time of famine, guess what? God is going to provide for his people. Now, what we see here with that teaching in chapter 1 is, how are you responding to God's provision? Because in verses 1 through 5, you have people saying, we are not patient enough for God's provision. In verses 6 through 13, you have, God takes away my provision. But in verses 14 to 18, you have, I'm going to go to God's provision. Now, I know that a lot of this sermon was probably here, there, and everywhere, talking about the Moabites, talking about Ruth, but there's a reason it's kind of everywhere, is because if you look back and see all of the pieces that look random, it actually paints a picture of God's provision. Now, question for us. This was written hundreds of years ago. This was pertaining to a cultures really, Moabites and Jewish culture, that are now really dead and extinct. How on earth could this apply to us today? Well, God is providing everywhere. The question for us is, how are we responding to his provision? Are we responding like Elimelech? He's not providing fast enough, so I've got to provide for myself. Are we responding in the grief and emotions of grief like Naomi? God has taken away all of my provision. Or are we going to respond like Ruth? I'm going to go where God provides. You know, we can make application all we want of the relationship between Naomi and Ruth. And you know what? We've got a character study series going on. We'll probably revisit this in more detail. But the main point of this chapter is God provides. It's right at the beginning. They say God doesn't provide fast enough. It's right in the middle. God, he's taken away my provision, and it's at the very end of the book, or the very end of the chapter, I'm going to go where God provides. And notice where they go. They go to Bethlehem, the house of bread, at the beginning of barley harvest, where there is all the bread they can have. What is our Bethlehem? The house of bread. Our Bethlehem is Jesus the Christ, the bread of life. And it's where we can find all the bread and sustenance that we can that will satisfy us and more. But you know what? The only way we can receive that provision is if we go back to God. Maybe you're like Elimelech. You're impatient. You're not allowing God to provide for you the way God sees fit. And so you've been trying to provide for yourself for far too long, and all you've found is bitterness and death. Maybe you're like Naomi. You're going through trials, and you're responding, not really responding, you're reacting in emotion and grief and pain, and you're casting all of the blame upon God. God has done this to me. He's taken away all my provision. Or maybe you need to be like Ruth, who says, you know what? I want to go where God is. I want to go where God's provision is, and abundantly. And if you are like the first two and you want to be like the third, that is Ruth, you can do that now as together we stand and as we sing.